Li boasted that he could capture a city with just 800 soldiers in front of these people. Upon hearing this, several high command burst into laughter. One of them, curious about his abilities, immediately decided to give him 1,500 soldiers to see how he could capture the city within 10 days. What Li didn't expect was that he wouldn't have control over these 1,500 troops. Their commander belonged to someone else, and this commander was unwilling to send his men to their deaths. He only agreed to give Li show of force on the battlefield, so although they claimed to have several thousand soldiers, only 800 were actually available for combat. The enemy army was formidable, not only consisting of 5,000 elite soldiers but also armed with firearms, with a range 100 yards longer than that of bows and arrows. In order to buy time for the archers to attack, Li sent out a daring 200-man vanguard straight towards the enemy's guns. These men risked their lives, relentlessly advancing. As the ones in front fell, those behind continued to charge forward. They ultimately managed to gain a distance of 100 yards, where arrows rained down on the enemy camp, throwing the firearm unit into disarray. Following this, the cavalry launched a charge, engaging the enemy head-on. Despite their small numbers, fueled by a spirit of recklessness, the cavalry managed to cause the deaths of half of the enemy's elite soldiers. In an attempt to turn the tide, the enemy commander ordered the firing of cannons, blasting the cavalry into disarray. At this moment, the assigned commander was still observing from the rear. Li had no choice but to lead his remaining troops in a final charge towards the enemy camp. Li understood that if he wanted the commander to lead the troops into battle, the only way was to show him a glimmer of hope for victory. So, he spared no effort and fought against the enemy soldiers at the risk of his own life. What surprised everyone was that, with this determination, Li indeed managed to defeat the enemy's 5,000 soldiers with just 800 men. At this point, even the commander realized that victory was within reach. He decisively led his troops into battle, and within moments, they had felled the enemy commander from his horse and successfully taken the city. However, who could have imagined that the formidable Li standing before them had almost perished on the battlefield not long ago? Li was originally a commander tasked with suppressing rebel forces. But in a battle, the commander who was supposed to assist him betrayed him, resulting in the annihilation of Li's entire army. He miraculously survived and was sheltered by a woman. To survive, Li sold off all his weapons and then mingled with the refugees. At a loss for what to do, he encountered the bandit Takeshi. Seeing Li in military boots, Takeshi sensed that Li was someone significant and tested his skills with a knife. Seeing Li effortlessly handle the situation, Takeshi concluded that he was skilled and thus recruited him into the bandit group. Li followed the group up the mountain in confusion and later joined the gang leader Andy in robbing the rebel army's provisions. Though these bandits feared no death, they lacked discipline and soon fell into an ambush by the rebels. Just as Takeshi was about to die under the rebel's sword, Li grabbed the blade and seized the sword. He boldly charged forward and slew the rebel commander. With the commander's death, the battle ended, and amidst cheers, they returned with the provisions to the village. It was then that Li learned that the woman who saved him was Andy's wife. That night, he met the woman in the coal shed, thanked her for saving his life, and as they looked at each other, the atmosphere grew ambiguous. Just then, noises came from afar, revealing that the commander who had betrayed Li earlier had brought troops to the village to plunder provisions. Enraged, Andy prepared to fight them to the death, but they were outnumbered. Helpless, they could only watch as the village was ransacked, leaving everyone without food. Andy couldn't swallow this injustice but didn't know what to do. It was then that Li suggested joining the army, where they would have money, guns, and wouldn't have to starve or be bullied. Everyone was deeply moved by this suggestion, but one person reminded them that Li used to be a commander, and his proposal to join the army might be a plot. In order to reassure each other, the three men swore a blood oath and pledged loyalty to each other as brothers, with Li as the eldest brother, Andy as the second brother, and Takeshi as the third brother. Afterwards, the three men led all the bandits to join the army and successfully captured the city. After this battle, Li rose to prominence. Not only was he given the manpower of 5 battalions by the high command, but they also assigned the commanders who had once observed him to him. Li was overjoyed. However, soon after, the high command brought in the commanders who had betrayed Li to cooperate with him. Li was tasked with attacking cities, while they were responsible for taking over the captured territories. Li knew that one victorious battle was not enough to gain the government's trust. The high command's move was to have the commanders monitor Li. Following this, Li led his soldiers at full speed and successively captured several cities. The three brothers were immersed in the joy of victory, unaware that a private soldier had stirred up trouble at this moment. 3 soldiers insulted 2 women, who emerged disheveled after a long while and were caught red-handed by Li. These 3 individuals were former bandits under Andy's command, who, upon entering the city, had been looting money, food, and women. In order to maintain military discipline, Li immediately decided to administer justice on the spot. Andy pleaded, saying that even if they had made mistakes, it didn't warrant death. But Li told him, "You joined the army to prevent others from being bullied. Now I'm telling you, not only you, but even all the people in the world should not be bullied." With that, Andy was speechless, and Takeshi, to prevent further escalation, promptly killed the 3 men with his knife. From then on, Andy harbored resentment towards Li. He believed that righteousness should come first, and nothing was more important than brotherhood, but to have an invincible army, military discipline was essential. Li had an ideal of benefiting the people, and he was willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. Andy was deeply conflicted because he felt that the present Li was vastly different from the past. Then, with successive victories, Li became increasingly complacent. In order to realize his ideals as soon as possible, he disobeyed military orders and led his troops to attack the rebel-controlled city of Suzhou on his own. Originally, he expected to capture it within a few months, but unexpectedly, it took a year, with heavy casualties and depletion of supplies, leading to a stalemate with the enemy forces. In order to secure provisions, Li took Takeshi to seek assistance from the high command. He said he would rather let his soldiers die in battle than watch them starve to death. He even knelt down to beg the high command for provisions. His hysterical cries failed to convince the high command. They remained silent, leaving Li to handle the situation himself. Unable to find another solution, Li turned to the commanders who had betrayed him. He planned to use the promise of future success as leverage to obtain provisions. The commanders were tempted by this offer, so they granted Li 10 days' worth of provisions. Meanwhile, at the camp, Andy, seeing his soldiers on the brink of starvation, decided not to sit idly by. He sneaked into the city at night to assassinate the rebel commander, believing that only with the commander's death could the war end. However, he was met with a scene of carnage similar to that outside the city. The commander had been waiting for him, and after a few rounds of fighting, the rebel commander deliberately impaled himself on Andy's sword. Turned out the rebel commander had already decided to sacrifice himself to spare the lives of the city's civilians and soldiers. They agreed that after opening the city gates, the civilians should not be insulted, and all the soldiers should return home to farm. Just as Li was about to begin his assault, the city gates opened, and Andy walked out with his troops, capturing the city without shedding a drop of blood, which was a great joy for Li. However, the thousands of rebel soldiers before him posed a difficult problem. They refused to be assimilated, but dispersing them might lead to rearmament, and there wasn't enough food to treat them as prisoners. Li's only choice was to kill them all. Andy vehemently opposed this decision. He had promised the rebel commander to let these people live. But faced with such a cruel reality, Li had no choice but to bind Andy and order his soldiers to shoot. Thousands of rebel soldiers were thus killed under the city walls. Seeing the corpses covering the ground, Andy's faith collapsed. He couldn't accept becoming a traitor, so he decided to take his old comrades home. At that moment, Li was preparing to attack Nanjing, and Andy's departure would mean mutiny. To stabilize the situation, Li knelt down and begged Andy to stay. Andy couldn't bear to see his elder brother pleading like this, so he chose to stay. The plan to attack Nanjing proceeded as usual. True to expectations, Li's troops captured Nanjing in just 2 days, and the rebel army was thereby annihilated, bringing an end to the war. Andy remembered Li's promise to share the credit with other commanders. In order to prevent his old comrades from being shortchanged, he secretly diverted military funds behind Li's back. Li knew that Andy harbored considerable resentment towards him throughout this journey, so he tacitly accepted it. However, it was precisely this indulgence that led to the tragedy that followed. When the commanders who had betrayed Li learned of this, they were furious. They had agreed to share the spoils but ended up with nothing. Not only that, Empress Dowager Cixi intended to promote Li to the position of viceroy of the two Jiangs. If this happened, Li's power would be uncontested. To completely destroy Li, they found Andy. They told him that the capture of Nanjing depended entirely on him, but all the credit went to Li, intending to sow discord between the two brothers. However, he didn't fall for it. All he cared about was brotherhood. Meanwhile, Li was on a boat reminiscing with Andy's wife, a scene witnessed by Takeshi. Li warned him with his eyes not to reveal this incident. With this, cracks began to form in the relationship between the three brothers. Shortly after, Li was promoted to viceroy of the two Jiangs. Instead of immediately showing gratitude, he proposed to the Empress Dowager to exempt the people from 3 years of taxes. While this action indeed benefited the people, in the eyes of the court, Li didn't belong to any faction, and any of his actions could be seen as a threat. Therefore, the high command came to coax him. But Li believed he didn't need to get entangled with bureaucracy, his personal capabilities were enough to gain the Empress Dowager's trust. Unable to sway him, the high command bluntly stated that Li now wielded immense power. With countless eyes watching him closely, unfazed, Li told them he would lead by example and reduce the military size, but he didn't expect the high command had ulterior motives. The high command mentioned that Andy had considered desertion and had everyone's support, but later he secretly diverted military funds. They questioned Li about who was truly in charge among them. Although these words came from the mouth of the high command, they also reflected the Empress Dowager's intentions. In order to gain the Empress Dowager's trust, Li could only find a way to get rid of Andy. At this moment, Andy came to a realization: their paths as brothers had diverged, and rather than engage in deceitful games here, it was better to return to the countryside with his wife and live a peaceful life. Just as the two of them were preparing for this, their subordinates suddenly informed Andy that someone was planning to kill Li. Without further thought, Andy immediately rode out. On the way, he encountered a general who told him that Li was trapped outside the city. Andy turned around to rescue Li. Little did he know that all of this was a trap set by Li. Meanwhile, Takeshi discovered that the guards at Li's residence had been replaced, immediately realizing that something was amiss. He hurried to Andy's house, only to find out that Andy had already left. Realizing that Li intended to kill Andy, Takeshi rushed to Li's residence to confront him, demanding to know if Li planned to kill Andy and when he intended to do so. Upon hearing that there was still time, Takeshi immediately went to Andy's house. He believed that Li's intention to kill Andy was solely due to a dispute over a woman, so he took the initiative to kill Andy's wife, thinking that this would spare the brothers from harming each other. Meanwhile, Andy had fallen into the trap, unaware of his impending doom. Even in his final moments, he was searching for the figure of the commander. Early the next morning, Takeshi found Andy's body. Consumed by hatred for Li's ruthlessness, Takeshi intercepted Li on the day of his ennoblement ceremony and stabbed him in the chest with a dagger. The soldiers were about to intervene, but Li stopped them. He had long anticipated this day. The enmity between the brothers had to be resolved by him personally. Subsequently, Takeshi rushed forward and engaged in combat with Li. Takeshi mercilessly wielded his dagger, aiming for vital points, but his skills were no match for Li's. After just a few rounds, Li disarmed Takeshi. Knowing that he had acted unjustly, Li chose to defend rather than attack. The two were locked in a stalemate, with the ennoblement ceremony about to begin. Li initiated an attack, kicking Takeshi's left leg, intending to break free from the deadlock. However, Takeshi continued to attack despite his injured leg. Li pleaded with him to stop, but Takeshi was determined that only one of them would survive today. Li, filled with sorrow at seeing Takeshi battered and still throwing punches at him, reluctantly chose to break Takeshi's arm, step by step continuing towards his official position. Takeshi struggled to his feet, wielding his dagger and following behind. As the appointed time arrived and the cannons fired, someone shot Li in the back, and then Takeshi stabbed him in the chest. Li couldn't believe that he had sacrificed everything for his ideals, only to be defeated by bureaucracy in the end. Nanjing was an important city. How could the Empress Dowager entrust it to an outsider like Li? Now that the world was stable, it was time to get rid of the donkey after it had ground the millstone. In his final moments, Li finally saw everything clearly. He hoped to die at Takeshi's hands rather than being shot to death by the government's guns. Takeshi understood his wish and delivered the final blow. With this, Takeshi was defined by the government as the assassin who killed Li, and it was announced that he would be executed in 2 months, fulfilling the oath they made when they formed their brotherhood: in life different, in death the same.